The paper sat on the table between them like a loaded gun. Mary Slater's hand hovered above the deed, her fingers trembling so slightly that only someone watching with the kind of painful attention Joseph Redmond was paying would have noticed it at all. The ink on the document was still sharp and black, the words absolute and final. Transfer of title. Slater Ranch. 160 acres of the most fertile land in Calhoun County, Texas. The date at the bottom read April 14, 1884. The price written in the box was an insult, $2,000, barely enough to pay the debts her dead husband had run up in the last 6 months of his life, debts she had only discovered after the funeral, debts that had arrived in her mailbox like a second burial. Joseph stood on the far side of his kitchen table, his hat in his hands, and he was not looking at the document. He was looking at her. He had expected a different woman. He had expected someone hardened by grief, someone who arrived at his door with her jaw set and her eyes empty, ready to be done with the whole transaction. He had expected someone who would have no trouble scratching her name across the bottom of that page and walking away with a check and a hollow kind of relief. He had not expected Mary Slater to look like this. She was 28 years old, and she had ridden 14 miles on a rented horse in the April heat, and the dust of the road was still on her dark blue dress, and there was a weariness behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the ride and everything to do with the last 8 months. She had not slept well. He could see that in the faint bruising beneath her eyes. She had not eaten well either. He could see that in the sharp line of her collarbones above the top button of her dress, in the slight hollowness of her cheeks that should not have been hollow on a woman her age. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook harder. And Joseph Redmond, who had spent 3 years waiting for this land to come available, who had scraped and saved and worked his own ranch to the bone to have the capital ready for exactly this moment, looked at this woman who was about to sign away everything she had ever known and asked the most unexpected question of his life. "Mrs. Slater," he said quietly, "have you eaten today?" The pen stopped moving. Mary looked up at him. Her dark eyes searched his face for the trick in it, for the pity that would have been worse than silence, for the condescension. She found neither. What she found instead was something so disarmingly genuine that it cracked something open behind her sternum, something she had been keeping sealed since the morning she had found Thomas dead in the barn, since the afternoon the banker had come to the house with his ledgers, since every long night she had spent alone with the weight of an inheritance that had turned out to be nothing more than a beautiful trap. "I don't see what that has to do with the deed," she said. "Nothing," Joseph said simply. "It has nothing to do with the deed. The deed will wait 5 minutes. Sit down, Mrs. Slater. Let me feed you something before we do this." 8 months earlier, Mary had arrived in Calhoun County as a new bride. She had met Thomas Slater in St. Louis, Missouri, in the summer of 1883. She was working as a seamstress in a dress shop on Market Street, and he had come in to purchase a gift for his sister back in Texas. And he had been handsome in the way that men from open country always seem handsome in cities, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, moving through the narrow aisles of the shop like a man accustomed to having horizons. He had been charming. He had told her about his ranch in a way that made it sound like an Eden. 160 acres of rolling grassland and a creek that ran year-round. A house with a real parlor and glass windows on every side. Cattle that were multiplying into a small fortune. She had been 27 years old, unmarried, living alone in a boarding house, sending half her wages home to her widowed mother in Cincinnati. She had been lonely in the particular way that a woman living alone in a city becomes lonely surrounded by people and utterly invisible to all of them. Thomas Slater had seen her, or she had believed he had. They were married in September 1883. And she had ridden the train south and west with everything she owned packed into 2 trunks, watching the cities and then the towns, and then the settlements thin out until there was nothing outside the window but grass and sky and the occasional stand of live oak trees, and she had felt something that was almost like freedom. The ranch was real. The house was real. The glass windows were real. But the cattle were fewer than he had described, and the house needed repairs he had been putting off for years. And Thomas Slater, in the daily reality of marriage, was not the same Thomas Slater who had charmed her in a dress shop in St. Louis. He was short-tempered and proud and deeply in debt to a man named Vernon Holt, who operated out of a bank in the county seat at Millhaven, and the debts had been growing quietly for 3 years before Mary ever arrived. She had not known any of this. Thomas had kept his ledgers in a locked box in the barn and told her money was fine whenever she asked, told her things were coming together, told her the next season would be better. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe him, and because she had not yet learned that wanting to believe something is not the same as having evidence for it. Thomas died in January 1884. His horse threw him in the north pasture on a cold morning, and he struck his head against a rock in the dry creek bed, and by the time the neighbor's boy found him and rode for help it was already too late. He was 41 years old. They had been married 4 months. The debts arrived with the spring thaw. Vernon Holt came to the house himself, which told Mary everything she needed to know about how large the number was. He was a precise man in a dark suit with a gold watch chain, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table with his ledgers open, and explained to her in the measured tones of a man who had done this many times that the estate of Thomas Slater owed his bank $2,300, that this debt was secured against the property, that if the debt was not satisfied within 90 days, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Mary had listened to all of this without speaking, and when Holt was finished she had asked him one question. "Is there a buyer?" Holt had studied her for a moment, and something had moved behind his eyes that she could not quite read. Then he had told her that there was indeed a neighboring rancher who had expressed interest in the Slater property over the years, a man named Joseph Redmond, who owned the adjacent land to the north and east. He had told her that if she was willing to sell, the price Redmond had offered would cover the debt to the bank and leave her with a small amount to start over somewhere else. She had said she would think about it. She had spent 3 weeks thinking about it. She had walked every acre of that land in the cold Texas spring, learning what she owned as it was already leaving her. She had sat in the parlor with the glass windows that Thomas had described in St. Louis, and tried to feel something other than the particular devastation of realizing that the life she had come here to build had never actually been solid ground beneath her feet. It had been debt, an illusion dressed up in the language of promise. On the 14th of April, she had ridden to Joseph Redmond's ranch to sign the deed. The kitchen where she sat now was large and clean, and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something baking. The stove was iron and the table was pine, scarred from years of use, and the window above the wash basin looked out onto a yard where a big bay horse stood at the fence in the afternoon light. The room was the room of a man who lived alone and had made a certain deliberate peace with that solitude, nothing wasted, nothing ornamental, but nothing neglected either. Joseph set a plate in front of her. It was cornbread, warm from the oven, and a bowl of bean stew that had been keeping on the back of the stove, and a cup of coffee that was strong and black and real in a way that felt almost violent after the thin, watery coffee she had been making herself at the ranch with the last of the grounds from a tin that was nearly empty. Mary stared at the food for a moment. She was not going to cry. She had made herself that promise in January, standing at the grave in the cold ground behind the ranch house, and she had kept it through everything that had come after, through the arrival of Holt's ledgers and the long nights of calculation, and the morning she had finally accepted what she already knew. She was not going to cry now over a bowl of bean stew. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I've got the deed ready when you are," Joseph said, sitting down across from her with his own coffee, not his own food, just the coffee, as if he was not hungry. "There's no hurry." She looked up at him. "Mr. Redmond, you have been waiting for this land for 3 years. Your hurry is sitting right there on the table with my name on it." A brief thing moved across his face, not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. "That's true," he said, "but I've been a rancher long enough to know that a deal made while one party is too tired and hungry to think straight isn't a deal that sits well with a man or a woman. You're concerned about sitting well with yourself." "Partly," he admitted. "And partly I looked at you when you rode into my yard and thought that you look like a woman who has been carrying something very heavy alone for a long time, and I thought a hot meal was the decent thing to offer before I add to that weight." Mary looked at him across the table. Joseph Redmond was 34 years old. He was not remarkable looking in any particular way that she could have easily described to someone, not in the way Thomas had been remarkable, with his easy handsomeness and his gift for the first impression. Redmond was quieter than that. He was broad through the shoulders and lean through the face, with dark brown hair that was going just slightly at the temples, and gray eyes that were the particular gray of a sky just before weather, and hands on the coffee cup that were the hands of a man who worked his own land, calloused and strong and not apologizing for it. He had an honesty about him that was almost uncomfortable. It sat in the room like a third person. "You knew Thomas," she said. "It was not a question." "I did." "Well." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Slater was a man who made things look a certain way from the outside," Joseph said finally, choosing his words with the care of someone who understands that the truth and the kind truth are not always the same thing. "He was good company at a cattle drive. He was not what I would call a careful man." "He was in debt for 3 years before I arrived," Mary said. "Did you know that?" "I knew something of it." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Why didn't you say something?" When you saw him courting, or when he brought me here." "I'd met you once," Joseph said. "At the church social in October. You were his wife." "It wasn't my place to walk up to you and say, 'Mrs. Slater, your husband's finances are in a bad state.'" And Thomas was not a man who received that kind of news from a neighbor gracefully. She thought about that. It was honest. She appreciated it, even though it also meant that she had been entirely alone in not knowing the truth. She ate the cornbread. It was good real butter in it and a little honey. She ate the stew slowly, because she had learned in the last weeks that her stomach had developed the cautious habits of poverty and did not always welcome food quickly anymore. Joseph watched her without watching her, which was a skill she noticed, the way he kept his eyes largely on his coffee cup or the table or the window, giving her the privacy of the meal without the performance of deliberate inattention. "This is your land already, isn't it?" she said after a while. "In your mind. You've been planning for it." "I have," he said. "There was no defensiveness in it. The creek on the east boundary of your property, the Slater property, is the same creek that feeds my north pasture, and the water rights have always been awkward because the property line cuts through it at a peculiar angle. I had the capital ready, and I'd spoken to Holt about my interest. But I want you to understand something, Mrs. Slater." "What?" "I never wanted it to come to you through a funeral." She believed him. That was the strange thing. She sat in this stranger's kitchen eating his food with the deed to her dead husband's land on the table between them, and she believed what he said, and she was not sure she had entirely believed anything anyone had said to her in the last 8 months. "What will I do?" she said, and she said it not quite to him, not quite aloud, the way you say a thing when you are finally letting yourself face the actual question you have been avoiding. Joseph said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" "I had plans," she said. "When I came here, I was going to learn the land. I was going to make a proper kitchen garden. There was a stretch along the south fence where the soil looked like it would take vegetables, and I wanted to build it up with composting over the winter so I could plant in the spring." She paused. "That seems very far away now." "It doesn't have to be." She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes. "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, Mrs. Slater. I'm saying that if you're telling me you want to work land, that is not a door that closes just because a particular piece of land is no longer yours. There's other land in this county. There are ways forward that don't involve going back to St. Louis or Cincinnati or wherever it is you came from. You know I'm from Cincinnati. Millhaven is a small town. People know things." She set down her spoon. What do people know about me? Something flickered in his expression. They know you're a decent woman who married a man who wasn't entirely honest with her about his circumstances, and that you have handled a genuinely terrible situation with more dignity than most people could manage. That's what they know. Mary felt something hot press behind her eyes and pressed it back down. That is a very generous interpretation. It's the true one. She looked out the window at the bay horse in the yard. The afternoon light was long and warm on the grass, and somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle and the sound of a windmill turning in the slight breeze. And the day was very quiet in the way that days on the Texas plain are quiet, not empty but full of a kind of attending silence, as if the land itself was listening. "My mother is in Cincinnati," she said. "I have been sending her money since I was 17 years old. She depends on it. I cannot go back there and be one more burden on a household that is already too thin." "Then don't go back. I don't know what else to do," the words cost her. She could tell by the way they felt leaving her mouth, raw and honest in a way she had not been with anyone. Not with Holt, and not with the neighbor women who had brought food and sympathy after Thomas's funeral, and not with the attorney she had consulted in Millhaven about the estate. She had kept the actual fear of it behind a wall of capable, dignified behavior, and she was letting it out now into this stranger's kitchen, and she was not sure why. Maybe because he had fed her. Maybe because he had looked at her when she arrived and seen something other than a transaction. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. He refilled her coffee without asking. Then he said, "I have a proposal, Mrs. Slater, and I want you to hear it before you decide what it is." She waited. "I am going to need someone to manage the household here," he said. "This is not a romantic proposal. I want to be clear about that before I go any further because I know it would be inappropriate, and you are a woman who has just lost her husband and you deserve to have your grief respected. I am talking about employment. I have more land than one man can manage easily, and I have been neglecting the domestic side of running a working ranch for 3 years because I've been focusing on the cattle operation, and the truth is I need help. A cook and a housekeeper. Someone who can manage the household accounts and the supply orders and the kitchen garden, all of which I have been letting go because I don't have enough hours in the day." Mary stared at him. "I would pay you a fair wage," Joseph continued. "Enough to send something to your mother in Cincinnati and still have something left for yourself. You would have the room at the back of the house. It's private. It has its own door onto the yard. It's not a servant's closet. It's a real room. And you could plant your kitchen garden along the south fence here because that soil is the same as it is on the Slater property. They're the same formation." She was still staring at him. "You are offering me a job," she said. "I am. The day I come to sign away my husband's land." "Yes." She looked at the deed on the table. Then she looked at the man across from it. "Why?" she said. "And I want the honest reason, not the practical one you just gave me." Joseph's jaw worked slightly. He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked back at her, and the honesty that she had noticed sitting in this room like a third presence seemed to press forward. "Because I watched you ride into my yard today," he said carefully, "and I thought, that woman is about to do the hardest thing she's ever done, and she's going to do it alone, and she doesn't have to. That's the honest reason." Mary sat with that for a while. She picked up the pen. She looked at the deed. She signed her name, Mary Slater, in the clear, careful hand she had learned in the Cincinnati schoolroom where she had sat as a girl dreaming of something larger than the life her mother was living. The letters were very neat and very final. She put the pen down. "I'll take the job," she said, "on the condition that we are absolutely clear about what it is and what it is not." "Agreed," Joseph said, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, something that might have been relief. "And Mr. Redmond, yes, this cornbread is the best thing I have eaten in 4 months." That thing that was not quite a smile moved across his face again. This time it went a little further. The first weeks were careful. They moved around each other in the house and on the property with the particular deliberateness of two people who are aware of each other in a way they are not quite prepared to examine. Mary established herself in the back room. It was larger than she had expected, with a south-facing window and good light in the mornings, and she put her things in it slowly, one item at a time, as if she was not quite committing to the permanence of it. She hung the small mirror she had brought from St. Louis. She set the framed photograph of her mother on the windowsill. She found in the second week that she slept better in this room than she had in any room since October. She cooked. She was a good cook. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her own mother, and there was a particular satisfaction in cooking on a decent stove with a well-stocked larder, which was what Joseph's kitchen was. He had ordered supplies regularly and well. He simply had not known what to do with them beyond the basics. She made proper meals 3 times a day, and found that the act of feeding someone well, of watching food that she had made with care disappear from a plate, satisfied something in her that had gone unmet for a long time. Joseph ate everything she put in front of him with the genuine appreciation of a man who had been feeding himself indifferently for years, and he thanked her for it every time, not in the showy way but in the quiet, sincere way that is more valuable because it costs something to mean it. She managed the household accounts. She went through the supply ledgers and found 3 places where he had been overcharged by the general store in Millhaven through the simple inattention of not checking the figures. And she corrected them and sent a letter to the store's owner that resulted in a credit that paid for a month of flour and salt. Joseph looked at the corrected ledger when she showed him and said nothing for a moment, then said, "You're good at this." "I kept the books for the dress shop in St. Louis," she said. "Mr. Hands trusted me with it. He was right, too." She planted the kitchen garden along the south fence. It was late April and the soil needed work. She turned it herself with a fork and worked in composting material from the barn and the kitchen scraps, and Joseph watched her from the fence one afternoon with an expression she caught only in the corner of her eye before she turned away from it. "You don't need to do the turning yourself," he said. "I can do it." "I know how to turn soil," she said, not unpleasantly. "I know you do, that's not what I said." She looked up at him. He was leaning on the fence with his arms crossed on the top rail, his hat pushed back, and the late afternoon sun was behind him. "I want to do it myself," she said. "I want to have built it myself. Do you understand that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I understand that." He did not offer again. But the next morning she found that someone had sharpened the fork and oiled the handle, which had been slightly rough, and left it leaning against the fence ready for her. She did not mention it to him, but she thought about it. May arrived with sudden warmth and the smell of wildflowers on the south wind, and the ranch came alive in the way that a working cattle operation in Texas comes alive in late spring, the pastures greening, the calves growing into something, the long days stretching out with work and light. Mary learned the rhythms of it. She learned which hands came to work which days, and she learned their names and the way they took their coffee, and she made sure there was food available at the times they arrived and departed, because she had noticed that Joseph fed his crew out of his own kitchen when the work was heavy, and she thought this was a good way to run a ranch and decided to support it. There were 2 permanent hands, a man named Calhoun Webb, who was 50 years old and had been working this land since before Joseph bought it, and a young man named Rafael Diaz, who was 19 years old and had ridden up from San Antonio the previous fall looking for work, and whom Joseph had hired on the spot because, as Calhoun told Mary one morning, the boy could do the work of 2 men and was afraid of nothing. Calhoun Webb had opinions about Mary being at the ranch that he expressed entirely through the temperature of his silences. He was not hostile, he was watchful. He had the loyalty of a man who has worked for the same employer for many years and measures every new element of that person's life against the standard of whether it is good for him. And he had not yet decided about Mary. Rafael Diaz, on the other hand, had decided about Mary within approximately 48 hours of her arrival, which was that she was a fine cook, and that if she needed anything carried from the store or repaired in the house or any other practical task performed, He was entirely available, and would she like to see a demonstration of his ability to move an extremely heavy barrel of rainwater from one side of the yard to the other? Mary appreciated Raphael. She also appreciated that he was genuinely good-natured and absolutely without guile, which meant she could read him clearly, which was restful after the opacity of Thomas's last months. One evening in mid-May, Joseph came in from the pasture late, past the time dinner was usually kept, and Mary had already eaten and Calhoun and Raphael had gone home, and the kitchen was quiet. She had kept a plate warm on the back of the stove, and she brought it to the table and set it down and turned to go back to her room, and he said, "You don't have to leave on my account." She stopped. "I mean," he said, pulling off his hat and hanging it on the hook by the door, "if you were sitting here before I came in, you can keep sitting here. I'm not going to disrupt your evening." She considered this. She had been reading, there was a newspaper from Millhaven that Calhoun had brought, and she had been going through it methodically, reading everything in it, because she had always had a hunger for print that the limited news from a small town still satisfied partially. She retrieved the newspaper from the parlor and sat back down at the other end of the table and read while he ate. It was surprisingly comfortable. He did not talk while he ate, which she respected, and she did not feel the need to fill the silence, and the lamp made a warm circle of light over the table, and outside the window the May dark was soft and full of insects, and she read an article about the new county commissioner's plans for road improvements, and he ate his dinner, and the domesticity of it settled around them both like something they had agreed to without speaking about it. After a while he said, "Anything interesting in the paper?" She told him about the county commissioner. He had thoughts about the road improvements that were direct and informed by the practical reality of moving cattle to market, and she had thoughts about the political dimensions of which properties would benefit from those improvements and which wouldn't, and they talked about it for 20 minutes in the natural back-and forth of two people whose minds engage well with each other, and then they both noticed that this was what they were doing, and there was a brief pause. "You are not what I expected," Joseph said. "What did you expect?" He thought about this honestly. Someone who would count the days until she had saved enough to leave. Mary folded the newspaper slowly. "Maybe I am that person," she said. "I don't know yet. Fair enough. What do you want me to be?" The question came out more direct than she intended, and she saw it land on him, saw him sit with it for a moment before answering. "I want you to be whoever you actually are," he said. "That's all." She went to bed that night and lay in the dark with her south-facing window open to the warm air and thought about that for a long time. June brought two things: the kitchen garden coming up in real and promising rows, and Vernon Holt. Holt arrived on a Tuesday morning in his good suit, driving a buggy, and Mary was in the garden when she saw him coming up the road and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She straightened and watched him, and when he turned into the yard, she called for Joseph. Joseph came out of the barn. Holt climbed down from the buggy and adjusted his coat and extended his hand to Joseph with a smile that was the particular smile of a man who is calculating something. "Redmond," he said, "and Mrs. Slater, what a pleasant surprise." "She works here," Joseph said. His tone was even. "Of course." Holt's eyes moved over Mary with an assessment she did not like. "I came about the deed. There's a small matter of a clerical correction needed in the transfer documents. The survey description has an error in the boundary notation for the East Creek boundary, and it needs to be corrected and refiled." Joseph looked at him. "Send me the corrected document by mail and I'll sign it." "I'd prefer to handle it in person," Holt said smoothly. "There are some additional details to discuss about the water rights which I think you'll want to address promptly." Mary watched the exchange. There was something off about Holt that she had sensed the first time he arrived at the Slater ranch with his ledgers, something that lived beneath the surface of his precise manner, a quality of calculation that was a little too fine, a little too deliberate. She had chalked it up to his being a banker because bankers calculated things by nature. But watching him now, watching the way he kept glancing at her, she was less certain. "The water rights are settled in the deed," Joseph said. "Partly," Holt said. There is also the matter of a verbal agreement Thomas Slater made with the bank regarding the use of the creek for irrigation access on a parcel of land adjacent to the southeast boundary land that the bank currently holds as collateral on another note. Joseph was very still. Thomas Slater made no verbal agreement with your bank that I know of. He did, Holt said. I'm afraid I have a witness. That evening, after Holt had gone promising to return with the corrected documents and the witness statement, Mary sat at the kitchen table with Joseph, and they looked at each other across the familiar pine surface. He's lying, she said. Probably, Joseph agreed. The question is what he wants. He wants the creek access, she said. He has that other piece of land, the southeast parcel, and without creek access it's worth very little. Thomas might have promised him something. Thomas was the sort of man who made promises he couldn't keep, but whether he actually made a legal agreement is a different matter. Joseph leaned back in his chair. How do you know about the southeast parcel? Because I walked every boundary of the Slater land when I was deciding whether to sell, she said. I looked at every adjacent property. The southeast parcel is 60 acres of good grass with no water source of its own. It's been sitting empty for 2 years. Holt bought it at a tax sale. Without the creek access, it's essentially worthless to him. Joseph looked at her with something in his expression that was new, something she had not seen there before. You're telling me you mapped the value relationships between the properties. I like to understand things, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Do you know who the attorney is in Millhaven who is not Holt's man? Harris, she said. Franklin Harris. He has an office on the main street above the leather shop. He represented the Comstock family in their boundary dispute 2 years ago and won it. Joseph looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, How long has your mind been working this hard on problems that aren't yours to solve? The question caught her off guard. They became partly mine, she said carefully, when I came to work here. Yes, he said, they did. There was something in that exchange that changed the quality of the silence between them. It was a recognition, and it sat there on the table along with the cold cups of coffee and the lamp burning between them, and neither of them picked it up and named it, but neither of them pretended it wasn't there. They went to see Franklin Harris the next morning. Harris was a dry, careful man in his 50s who listened to Joseph's account of Holt's visit with his fingers steepled and his eyes on the ceiling. And then he said, Verbal agreements regarding property rights in Texas in 1884 are not enforceable unless witnessed, documented, and registered with the county clerk. If Holt has a witness, we need to know who it is, because that witness is either mistaken, pressured, or in Holt's pocket. If it's the latter, that's a significantly more serious situation. Why? Mary asked. Harris looked at her over his spectacles. Because if Holt is manufacturing evidence, Mrs. Slater, then he is not doing so for 60 acres of dry grass. He is doing it for something else, and we need to figure out what. They found out 2 weeks later. The witness Holt produced was a man named Dale Ferris, who claimed to have been present at a conversation between Thomas Slater and Vernon Holt, in which Thomas had agreed to grant permanent creek access in exchange for a delay in the bank's foreclosure action. Ferris was a drifter who had apparently done odd work around the county, the kind of man who existed at the edge of a community and owed favors to whoever fed him. Franklin Harris took Dale Ferris's deposition in the Millhaven courthouse and spent 45 minutes asking him very precise questions about the date, time, and specific words of the alleged conversation. And Ferris's answers changed in 3 significant ways between the beginning and end of the questioning. And Harris produced a hotel register from a town 60 miles away showing that on the date Ferris claimed to have been present at the Slater Ranch, he had signed into a boarding house in Pecos, Texas. The witness was a fraud. Holt did not come quietly. He sent 2 men to Joseph's ranch on a hot Thursday in July. Not gunmen. Nothing so theatrical as that. Just 2 large men in a buggy who arrived while Joseph was at the south pasture and knocked on the kitchen door while Mary was making bread. and told her in very polite terms that Mr. Holt would like to speak with Mr. Redmond about a private matter, and would Mr. Redmond please come to the bank at his earliest convenience. Mary said that Mr. Redmond would receive Mr. Holt's correspondence through Mr. Harris's office, and she said it so calmly and so clearly that the two large men looked at each other and then at her, and then departed. When Joseph came in for lunch and she told him, his jaw went tight and his eyes went to the window and then came back to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said, "though I think you should put a lock on the kitchen door." He almost smiled. Then he said, "Mary." It was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it simultaneously. She kept her eyes on the bread she was shaping. He said nothing more for a moment. "Mary," he said again, more quietly, "I want you to know that I appreciate what you did, what you've been doing with all of this." "You're not going to tell me it isn't my concern," she said. "No," he said, "because it is your concern. This whole situation began with your husband's land, and Holt's behavior is partly a consequence of your position here, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She looked up at him then. He was standing in the middle of his kitchen in his work clothes, hat in hand again, as he always was when he was being serious about something, and there was an earnestness in his face that she had been carefully not looking at directly for 2 months, and that she looked at now because she was tired of being careful about it. "Why did Thomas owe Holt so much money?" she asked. "The real reason." Joseph was still for a moment. Then he sat down across from her at the table. "Because Thomas had ideas that were larger than his resources," he said. "He wanted to expand the herd, which would have required a second well and repairs to the north fence and additional feed for the winter. He borrowed against the property to do it. The cattle prices dropped in '82, and the expansion never paid what he'd projected, and the debt grew instead of shrinking. He told me things were fine. He told everyone things were fine." Joseph looked at his hands. "I tried once in the fall of '83, just before you arrived, to talk to him about what I was hearing from people in town. He told me to mind my own business, and we didn't speak for 6 weeks after that." "You were protecting your own investment," she said, "the land you wanted to buy." "Maybe partly," he said honestly, "and partly because I didn't like watching a man drive himself off a cliff." Mary set the bread to rise and sat down across from him. "I'm not angry with you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I was angry with Thomas for a while after I understood everything, but he's gone, and I was angry with myself for not seeing it for a longer while. But that it is what it is." She paused. "I'm not a woman who carries anger when the thing that caused it is past. It costs too much." "What do you carry instead?" he asked, not casually. He genuinely wanted to know. She thought about this. "Plans," she said. "I carry plans." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the warm July light of the kitchen there was something between them that was not quite sayable yet, something that had been building slowly and quietly since April, and that the pressure of Holt's machinations had accelerated into something she could feel in the air of the room. "Then let's make a plan about Holt," he said. Franklin Harris sent a formal letter to Holt's bank, citing the discredited witness testimony and the hotel register evidence, and notified him that any further attempts to establish a claim against the Redmond property through fabricated evidence would be met with a complaint to the state banking board. Harris had connections to the banking board through a former colleague in Austin, and Holt knew it. Holt backed down. It was not graceful, and it was not immediate. He made 2 more attempts, one a second letter citing a different provision of an old county ordinance, and one a direct conversation with Joseph at the Millhaven feed store that Calhoun Webb overheard and reported back to the ranch. But by August it was clear that he had decided the legal risk was too great, and the southeast parcel was not worth a fight he was going to lose. The East Creek boundary ran clear and undisputed across Joseph's land. August on the Texas plain was heat and work, and the particular beauty of a landscape that does not soften in summer but intensifies, burning everything down to its essential colors. The gold of the grass and the deep green of the creek willows and the blue sky that went on forever in every direction. Mary's kitchen garden was producing. She had tomatoes and beans and squash and a row of herbs along the fence, rosemary and sage and thyme, and she stood in it in the early mornings before the heat came, watering with the big can, and she felt something that was not quite happiness yet but was the precursor of it, the ground preparation for it, the way you have to turn soil before you can plant. Joseph found reasons to be in the yard when she was in the garden. She noticed this. She found reasons to be in the yard when he was doing things in the yard. She noticed this too. They ate dinner together every evening. It had become the acknowledged habit of the household without either of them making a declaration about it. Raphael and Calhoun went home at dusk, and the kitchen was quiet, and they sat across the table from each other and ate and talked, and the talking had become the thing that Mary looked forward to most about each day, which told her something she was not quite ready to say aloud. Joseph Redmond had read everything he could get his hands on for 34 years, which meant he had opinions about things far beyond the boundaries of his own land. He had thoughts about the railroad expansion and what it was doing to cattle prices, and what it would eventually do to the whole structure of the ranching economy in Texas. He had thoughts about the political situation regarding the land rights of Mexican-American families in the region, families who had held land under Spanish and then Mexican grants, and were being systematically dispossessed by legal mechanisms that Joseph found deeply troubling and said so directly, and without the usual hedging Mary heard from other men on the topic. He had read Darwin and had thoughts. He had read Dickens and had more thoughts. She matched him in all of it. She had been reading since she could hold a book and had read everything accessible to a working girl in Cincinnati and then St. Louis, and she had a quick mind that Joseph clearly found as restful and exciting as she found his. They disagreed about things sometimes, about the railroad, about certain political questions, about how best to handle a particular supply problem, and the disagreements were clean and honest and did not leave damage behind them, which was new to her. Thomas had not been a man who liked to be disagreed with. One evening in late August, after a day of hard rain that had kept them both largely inside, they were sitting in the parlor for the first time. The kitchen was too warm after the day's cooking, and Mary had carried her book to the parlor and settled in the armchair by the window, and Joseph had followed with his own book and his lamp without making a ceremony of it, and she looked up from the page and found him looking at her. He did not look away. She said, "You're staring." "I know," he said. "Why?" He set the book down on his knee. "Because I have been trying for 4 months to be the proper kind of employer," he said, "and I am finding it increasingly difficult." Her heart was doing something she was trying to keep under control. "Mr. Redmond, Joseph," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Joseph," she said, "you should say what you're trying to say. You know what I'm trying to say. I want to hear you say it." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on her. "I am very far gone on you, Mary," he said. "And I know the timing is wrong, and the circumstances are complicated, and you came here to do a job and nothing else. And I am not going to make your position here uncomfortable by making demands or pressing for something you don't feel. But I also am not willing to sit in this room with you in the evening light and pretend I'm not the man I am." Mary sat very still. The rain was still coming down soft outside the window, and the lamp made everything warm and amber, and she was looking at this man who had fed her when she was hungry and given her ground to build on and stood beside her in a legal fight that was partly her legacy, and had never once tried to make her feel small or grateful in the diminishing way. "Thomas was the first man who ever told me he wanted me," she said quietly, "and it turned out to mean something different than I thought. I know. I don't want to be someone who needs to be rescued," she said. "I need you to understand that. I don't want to rescue you," he said. "I want to live alongside you. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long time. "I feel it too," she said. "I have for a while. I have been trying to be sensible about it." "Maybe we've both been sensible long enough," he said. She was aware of how close he was, the parlor not being large, and of the rain outside and the lamp between them and the whole weight of the quiet evening pressing down, with the particular quality of a moment that is about to become something you remember for the rest of your life. "Not tonight," she said. I want to think about it for a day. Not because I'm uncertain, but because I want to be sure I'm thinking clearly and not just because it's raining and the light is very favorable." He smiled at that. It was the real smile, the one she had been seeing glimpses of for months and had been cataloging privately, wide and warm and slightly rueful, the smile of a man who finds the world genuinely funny and generally good. "All right," he said. "Take the time you need." She thought about it for a day. The next morning she came into the kitchen while he was making coffee, which was the only thing he reliably made for himself, and she poured 2 cups and handed him one and said, "I'm done being sensible." He put the cup down very carefully, and then he put his hands on either side of her face, gentle and certain, and looked at her for just a moment the way you look at something before you are about to change its nature. And then he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that feels like a question whose answer you already know, and her hands went to his chest and felt the steady, certain beat of his heart. And outside the kitchen window, the Texas morning was blue and gold, and the garden was growing and the creek ran clear over its stones. They did not rush anything. This was partly temperament. They were both people who had learned through difficult experience that things rushed are things often regretted, and partly genuine care for each other, and partly the particular sweetness of something you have been wanting for long enough that the anticipation has become its own pleasure, and you are willing to extend it. They were honest with each other about what they felt and where they were, and they moved forward together in the way that 2 careful people who have already been hurt by carelessness move forward, which is slowly and with great attention and with enormous reward. By September, everyone in Millhaven knew that Joseph Redmond and the widow Slater were courting, because Calhoun Webb had told the man at the feed store with a tone of absolute inevitability, as if he had seen it coming from the first morning Mary had corrected the household ledgers, and the feed store man had told his wife, and that was that. The neighbor women who had brought food and sympathy after Thomas's funeral came to call in October, and Mary received them in the parlor with the good coffee and the shortbread she had made, and they were warm to her and curious about her, and visibly reassured by the fact that she seemed, as one of them told another in a voice Mary was not quite supposed to hear, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She did know. For the first time in a long time she knew exactly what she was doing. Joseph asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in October, standing in the kitchen garden which had finished its season and was going to ground for the winter, the dried stalks still smelling faintly of tomato and sage. He asked without ceremony, without getting on one knee, simply stopping what they were doing and turning to face her with the sun behind him and saying, "Mary, will you marry me?" Not because it's practical, and not because of how things look, and not because of anything except that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I want to spend my life next to you. Mary looked at the dried garden around them, the ground she had turned herself, the herbs she had planted, the small miraculous fact of the life she had built here from nothing, from the ashes of a bad marriage and a good grief, on land that had been bought with her signature. "Yes," she said, "without reservation." They were married in November 1884, in the Millhaven Church, which was a small white building on the edge of town with 6 rows of pews, and a pastor named Reverend Lyle, who conducted the ceremony with a brevity and a sincerity that suited them both. Calhoun Webb stood for Joseph with the expression of a man who has won a very long argument that nobody else knew was happening. Raphael Diaz arrived in a clean shirt and sat in the front pew and cried openly and without embarrassment, which everyone found charming. Mary's mother, who had made the long journey from Cincinnati on the train and arrived 3 days before the wedding looking thin and tired and absolutely fierce with maternal love, sat beside Raphael and held his hand in the maternal way and pretended she was not also crying. Mary's mother was named Mary Slater. She had taken back her maiden name after her own husband died, a practical woman's choice that Mary had always admired. And she was 54 years old and had the same dark eyes as her daughter and a spine like iron and the sharp, specific intelligence of a woman who had survived everything life had sent her way through a combination of careful thinking and refusal to accept what was not acceptable. Eleanor had met Joseph the morning she arrived, at the train platform in Millhaven, and had spent approximately 30 seconds looking at him while he carried her bags to the wagon and then had said quietly to Mary, "All right." Just those two words. Mary had understood them entirely. Joseph, for his part, had taken to Eleanor immediately, which Mary considered one of the more revealing things about his character, that he met her sharp and somewhat intimidating mother and liked her on the spot, asked her serious questions about her life in Cincinnati, and listened to the answers without condescension, and had her laughing at dinner the first night with a story about a cattle drive gone sideways that Mary had never heard before. After the wedding they ate dinner at the ranch. Mary had cooked most of it, with Eleanor's help, a real celebration dinner, a smoked ham and roasted sweet potatoes and 3 kinds of pie. And Calhoun and Raphael and 2 other hands who had been with the ranch through the season sat at the long table, and Eleanor sat at the corner with her coffee, and it was loud and warm and full of the particular generous noise of people who are genuinely happy. Later, when the guests had gone and Eleanor was settled in the back room that was now the guest room, Mary's room having been folded naturally into the larger life of the house, Mary stood at the kitchen window in the November dark and felt the solid, real weight of what her life was now, not the fragile, beautiful possibility of what it had seemed in St. Louis, the actual thing. The land and the house and the work and this man, who was somewhere nearby, probably checking on the horses one last time as he always did before coming in for the night, and who was her husband. She heard the kitchen door open and close. Joseph came to stand beside her at the window. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about how different this feels from what I thought I was getting the first time," she said, "and how strange it is that it took losing something to find something real." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and outside the window the November stars were very clear above the Texas plain, and the creek ran somewhere in the dark below the pasture, and the windmill turned in the cold air with its familiar speaking sound. "It wasn't all loss," he said. "Some of it was just the road." Eleanor stayed through December, which was a gift neither of them had quite expected. She was not a woman who inserted herself. She had her own strong preferences and opinions, but she expressed them with a directness that was not bullying, and she found her way into the life of the ranch with the adaptability of someone who had spent a lifetime adjusting to circumstances. She helped Mary with the preserving and the winter sowing. She taught Joseph a card game she had learned in Cincinnati that became a source of fierce competitive entertainment on the long winter evenings. She told Mary, the night before she left on the January train back to Cincinnati, that she had been afraid when she received the letter about the ranch sale and the new employment and the whole complicated situation with Holt and the deed. She had been afraid that Mary was making a mistake born of desperation, the way people make choices when they are standing at the edge of a cliff and reaching for anything. "But you're not desperate," Eleanor said. "You're grounded. I can see it in you. You found your ground." "He helped," Mary said. "You helped yourself," Eleanor said firmly. "He gave you the conditions for it. The helping was yours." Mary sent money home with Eleanor for the first time in months. Real money, enough to make a difference. The wages Joseph had continued to pay her even after the nature of her role changed, because as he had said matter-of-factly, she was running his household and managing his accounts, and that was work, and work deserved paying. She added a letter that she had written and rewritten, about the garden and the legal situation with Holt and the wedding and all of it, and at the end she wrote, "I am happy, Mother. I know what that word costs, and I am telling you I have earned it." The winter was long and cold as Texas winters go, which is not as cold as Cincinnati but cold enough, with a fierce blue norther in February that drove the temperature down hard and kept everyone close to the stove for 3 days. Mary and Joseph spent those 3 days in a kind of domestic intensity that was deeply satisfying, cooking together, reading together, talking in the way that only people who are genuinely interested in each other can sustain for hours, going to bed early in the way of married people in winter who have learned the pleasure of warmth. They talked about the future of the ranch. Joseph had plans that were careful and realistic. The water rights now settled meant he could expand the North Pasture's irrigation, which would increase the herd's winter capacity, which would allow for larger sales in the fall. He wanted to repair and expand the barn. He wanted to eventually put up a second structure for the hands, a proper bunkhouse, rather than the arrangement where Calhoun and Raphael slept in the tack room in bad weather. Mary had plans too. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden significantly in the spring, enough to sell at the Millhaven market on Saturdays, which she had noticed was consistently underserved on the vegetable side in summer when people who had not planted their own gardens were desperate for fresh produce. Joseph thought this was a good idea and said so, and then started talking about the logistics of getting a wagon to market and back, which turned into a longer conversation about whether they needed a second horse. They bought a second horse, a young chestnut mare that Mary named Ada, because she had read about Ada Lovelace in a magazine article that she found riveting, and because the horse had an extremely intelligent expression that seemed to warrant the name. In March, Mary told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table, where everything seemed to happen in the morning with the March light coming through the window, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It opened completely, every surface of it, all the careful reserve that was his default mode simply gone for a moment, replaced by something undefended and enormous. He reached across the table and took her hands. "When?" he asked. "October," she said. "Around the end of October, I think." He held her hands for a long moment, then he said, "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, terrified. She laughed and he laughed, and it was the specific laughter of people facing a large and good and terrifying thing together. He wrote to Alina that same day. Mary would not have expected him to do it first before her. She had been planning to write in the afternoon, but he sat at the kitchen table after breakfast and wrote Alina a letter that was careful and warm, and said, among other things, that he considered himself the luckiest man in Calhoun County, and that he intended to see to it that her daughter and grandchild wanted for nothing. He gave it to Mary to read before he sealed it. She added a note at the bottom in her own hand. "He means it, Mother. He always means what he says." Spring came with the garden to plant and the North Pasture expansion to begin, and the bunkhouse construction started by the end of April. Raphael, who turned out to have a gift for construction that nobody had previously known about, took a significant role in the bunkhouse building and finished it ahead of schedule, which Calhoun observed with the expression of a man whose estimation of someone has risen against his will. Mary watched her own shape change through the spring and early summer and found that she felt, on the whole, entirely at home in it. Joseph was attentive in the way she liked, present and watchful without being hovering, asking how she was feeling without asking it every 20 minutes. He took over the heavier parts of the kitchen garden work without being asked, and without making a ceremony of it, in the same way he had sharpened the fork and oiled the handle that first spring. She did not have to ask for things, and he did not make her feel managed, which was the particular combination she had discovered she needed. Calhoun Webb came to her one afternoon in June while she was sitting on the porch shelling peas. He stood at the foot of the steps with his hat in his hands, the same posture Joseph used when being serious. She noticed and looked at something in the middle distance and said, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Redmond." She waited. "I was not hospitable when you first came," he said. "I thought you were going to be a disruption, and I made up my mind before I had any evidence for it. That was wrong, and I want you to know I know it was wrong." Mary shelled a few more peas. "Calhoun," she said, The first month you were here you sharpened every tool in the kitchen garden shed and left them where I could find them. I decided we were even some time ago." He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. Something around his eyes relaxed. "All right," he said. "Good. The summer of 1885 was the summer the creek flooded. A series of heavy rains in July sent the creek out of its banks and into the low corner of the south pasture, which took out a section of fence and kept several of the cattle pinned to the higher ground for 2 days while the water was up. Joseph and Raphael and Calhoun worked for 3 days straight to repair the fence and move the cattle and shore up the creek bank with rock and timber. And Mary ran the household through all of it, keeping food and coffee ready at all hours, managing the supply of materials from the barn, sending Raphael to town twice for additional supplies with written lists that got him exactly what was needed without wasted time. On the 3rd day, when the creek had gone back down and the fence was repaired and the cattle were settled, Joseph came into the kitchen at 9 in the evening and sat down at the table and just looked at her for a moment with a tiredness that was the honest total exhaustion of 3 hard days. She put a plate in front of him and sat down across from him and said nothing. He ate. After a while he said, "We should talk about the creek bank." "I've been thinking about it," she said. "The flooding came in at the same angle both times. You've had minor flooding there before, haven't you?" "Once, in '82. So the creek wants to cut south at that bend. We need a proper rock revetment on the bank, not just timber shoring. There's rock on the north pasture hillside that would do. Calhoun knows where it is. He mentioned it once." Joseph looked at her across the plate. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since the 2nd day of the flood," she said. He put his fork down. "Mary," he said, in the tone he used when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while, "I want you to know something. The way this ranch runs now, it is not the way I ran it alone, and the difference is you. Not just the cooking and the accounts. The way you think about problems. The way you see the whole shape of things." She felt warmth move through her chest that had nothing to do with the August heat. "We think well together," she said. "We do," he said. "I want you to know I know that." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat that way for a while in the kitchen with the night outside and the creek settling back into its channel. The rock revetment was built in August and did not move when the fall rains came. On October 28, 1885, in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the doctor from Millhaven in attendance and a leaner who had arrived 2 weeks prior specifically for this occasion, Mary Redmond gave birth to a son. He weighed 7.5 pounds and had Joseph's gray eyes, or would, once they changed to their final color, and Mary's dark hair, a quantity of it for a newborn, and he arrived in the world with the decisive yelling of someone who has things to say. Joseph had been outside on the porch for the duration of it, which the doctor had firmly required, and a leaner had come to the door to tell him, and he had gone inside and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, this new and extraordinary creature wrapped in Mary's arms, and done the same thing he had done at the kitchen table in March, opened completely, all of it, no reserve. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. Mary had been thinking about this. "Daniel," she said. "Daniel Joseph Redmond." He looked at her. "You put my name in it. He'll need it eventually," she said, "when he has his own land." Joseph pressed his mouth to her temple very gently and held it there for a long moment. Calhoun Webb, informed of the birth by Raphael, who had ridden to the bunkhouse at speed despite it being past midnight, reportedly stood in the doorway of the new bunkhouse looking at the lit windows of the main house, and said nothing for a full minute, and then went back inside, and did not speak for the rest of the night, which Raphael told Mary the next day was the Calhoun Webb equivalent of a standing ovation. Alina stayed through December again, ostensibly because winter travel with a new infant was inadvisable, practically because nobody wanted her to leave. She had taken to Daniel with the ferocity of a grandmother who has been waiting for this specific job her entire life, and she held him and sang to him, and told him about Cincinnati in a low, steady voice, as if he were already old enough to follow the geography. And Joseph sat in the armchair in the parlor watching her do this with an expression of profound contentment. Mary found him there one evening when she came in from checking on Ada. The mare had been slightly off her feed, and she'd wanted to look in on her. The lamp was low, and Alina was asleep in the chair with Daniel on her chest, and Joseph was sitting across from them not reading but just watching. And Mary stopped in the doorway and looked at the whole scene, the warm lamp, the sleeping woman and baby, this man who was her husband, this house which was her home, this land outside the window which was her ground, and felt the full weight of it, the complete and real and hard-won goodness of it. Joseph looked up and saw her face, and he stood up carefully so as not to wake Alina or Daniel and came to the doorway where she was standing. "Good," he said quietly. "So good," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side in the familiar way, and they stood together in the doorway looking at the still scene in the lamplight. And she thought about the first day, the deed on the table and the pen in her hand and the question that had changed everything. Have you eaten today? And how unlikely it all was, and how it had all come from that single ordinary act of human decency. One person looking at another person and seeing not a transaction but a need. Spring came again. The garden was larger now, twice the size of the first year, with a proper cold frame Joseph had built in the winter months for the early starts, and a new section along the east fence that she was trying with flower seedlings to see if they would cut for the market. Ada the mare was expecting a foal, which was its own small event horizon of anticipation. Daniel, at 6 months, had developed the strong opinion that he preferred to be carried facing outward so he could see everything that was happening at all times, which Mary thought was both extremely reasonable and clearly a trait he had inherited from her. They went to the Millhaven Saturday market in April with the first of the early vegetables, radishes and spring onions, and the first lettuces from the cold frame, and Mary set up a table with a cloth on it and a handwritten sign, Redmond Ranch Garden, and sold out before noon, which she brought home and told Joseph about with the particular satisfaction of a plan working that you had been patient about. "Next week I'm bringing twice as much," she said. "I'll help you load the wagon," he said. "You don't need to come, you have the fence work on Saturday." "Raphael can start without me," he said. "I want to see it." She looked at him. "You want to see me sell radishes?" "I want to see you at the thing you built," he said simply. She let him come. He stood to the side and watched people approach the table and watched Mary talk to them. The quick, direct, warm way she had with people. The way she answered questions about growing and preserving and pricing with the confidence of someone who knows their subject. The way she made each transaction feel like a conversation. And at one point she glanced over at him and found him watching her with an expression she could only describe as radiant, which was not a word she would have applied to Joseph Redmond in any other context, but was the only accurate one for that moment. She sold out again. On the way home with the empty wagon and the money in the tin box in the back, she counted it and told him the total, and he said, "That's a significant contribution to the household income." "Yes," she said, because it was. "You should decide what to do with it," he said. "It goes into the household accounts." "Part of it," he said. "Part of it is yours, Mary. You built that from nothing." She thought about this for a while, the wagon moving through the warm spring afternoon with the birds loud in the creek willows. "I want to build a proper greenhouse," she said eventually. "If I had a greenhouse, I could grow through the winter and be the only market vendor with fresh greens in January. That would be worth. The greenhouse would pay for itself in 2 seasons," Joseph said. "Let's build it." They built it that summer. It was a proper structured timber frame with glass panes ordered from a supplier in San Antonio, south-facing on the east side of the house, large enough to work in comfortably. Raphael built it. Calhoun declared it the finest building on the property, which was a significant statement given that he had been part of building the bunkhouse and was not given to praise. The January market came and Mary was the only vendor with fresh winter greens, and the demand was more than she had brought, and she came home and told Joseph she needed to expand the greenhouse by a third. "This spring," he said. "This spring," she agreed. Eleanor, who had come back for Daniel's first birthday in October and had not quite left again, having developed an extremely comfortable arrangement in the guest room and a social life in Millhaven that she had somehow assembled from nothing over the course of 4 months, told Mary at Christmas that she thought she might stay permanently if no one objected. Mary looked at Joseph. Joseph looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Slater," he said, "this house is large enough and I would consider it a favor." Eleanor considered the offer with the dignity of a woman accepting something she has already decided to accept. "All right," she said. Eleanor Slater moved her things from Cincinnati in the spring of 1887, on the same train line that Mary had taken south in 1883, and arrived with 2 trunks and a crate of books and a rocking chair that had been her mother's. And Calhoun Webb helped carry everything in from the wagon, and Eleanor thanked him by name, and Calhoun turned slightly red and said it was no trouble. Mary noticed this. Over the following months she noticed it several more times, Eleanor at the kitchen table with the newspaper when Calhoun came in for the midday meal, Eleanor asking Calhoun's opinion about something to do with the horses, Calhoun always happening to be in the vicinity when Eleanor was in the yard. She mentioned it to Joseph one evening. He had already noticed. "It's not my place to say anything," he said. "They're grown people." "Calhoun is 53, Mary said. "He has been alone since I came here." "I think he's been alone for a very long time." "Your mother is 56 and has been alone for a longer time," Joseph said. Mary thought about this. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. By Christmas 1887, Calhoun Webb was calling Eleanor by her first name, and always sat next to her at the Sunday dinner table that Mary had established as a household tradition, and Eleanor brought him a piece of apple cake every Sunday morning from the week's baking, and he received it as if it were a significant gift, which perhaps it was. Mary did not comment. She simply made sure there was always an extra piece of apple cake. Daniel grew. He was 2 years old in October 1887 and running everywhere, deeply interested in the horses and the cattle, and in taking things apart to see how they worked, and entirely certain that all doors in the house were meant to be opened by him, regardless of what was behind them. And Joseph took him to the pasture fence every morning to look at the cattle, and Daniel named every single one of them with the arbitrary confidence of a 2-year-old, who has not yet learned that cattle are not individually named, and Joseph did not correct this. In the spring of 1888, Mary told Joseph she was expecting again. This time she told him in the garden because they were in the garden when she knew for certain, and it seemed fitting. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, and she saw the same opening of his face that she had seen twice before, once at the kitchen table in March 1885 and once in the doorway of the parlor with the lamp burning low, and she thought she would never tire of seeing that look on him. "November," she said, "I think. Daniel will be 3, he said." "He'll be an excellent older brother," she said. "He has opinions about everything and he'll want to share them all." Joseph laughed, and she laughed, and Daniel, who was nearby playing with a stick, looked up at the sound of his parents laughing together and laughed too, without knowing why, because the sound of it was simply contagious. Their daughter arrived in November 1888. They named her Clara Eleanor, and she had Joseph's gray eyes from the beginning in a way that Daniel's had taken months to settle, and she was quieter than her brother had been at birth, and seemed to arrive regarding everything with an assessment that was extremely reminiscent of her grandmother, which Eleanor took as the highest form of compliment. The ranch in 1888 was a different place than it had been in 1884. The herd had grown. The north pasture expansion and the rock revetment on the creek had done what they were meant to do, and the water supply was reliable, and the grass was thick, and the fall cattle sales had been the best in Joseph's tenure on the land. The greenhouse had been expanded twice, and was now a significant supplemental income. The winter greens, the early starts, the cut flowers that Mary had quietly made into a real production line over 3 years of patient development. The bunkhouse housed 3 hands now, Raphael and 2 newer men, because the operation had grown enough to require them. Calhoun Webb had, in October 1888, asked Mary Slater if she would do him the honor of accompanying him to the fall social in Millhaven, and Mary had said yes with the brevity and finality of a woman who has been waiting for a question she knew was coming, and had decided her answer some time ago. Mary had dressed Mary's hair for the occasion, and said nothing about it except that she looked beautiful, which was true. The fall social became a regular event for Calhoun and Mary through the winter and into the following year, and by the spring of 1889, Calhoun had said to Joseph, in the barn, in the straightforward way of a man who is not given to speeches, that he intended to ask Mary Slater to marry him if there was no objection. Joseph had said that there was absolutely no objection, and that he considered it the best piece of news he'd heard in some time. Then he came inside and told Mary, and she cried for the first time since January 1884, standing at the kitchen stove with the afternoon light coming through the window, and Joseph came up behind her and put his arms around her and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Calhoun and Mary were married in May 1889, in the same Millhaven church where Mary and Joseph had married, and they moved into a small house in Millhaven that Calhoun had bought and spent the winter fixing up, and Mary kept her room at the ranch as what she called her country house, which allowed her to see Daniel and Clara whenever she liked, and to sit at the kitchen table with the newspaper whenever she liked, and to tell Mary her opinions about the garden plans whenever she liked. And Mary accepted all of this because it was Mary, and that was simply how Mary was. Daniel, at 4 years old, was informed that his grandmother and Calhoun were married and considered this information carefully and then said, "Does that mean Calhoun will eat dinner at grandmother's house now?" And when told yes, said, "Good, because I want his chair," which settled the philosophical dimensions of the situation to his satisfaction. The summer of 1889 was the summer Mary went to Austin. She had been corresponding with a woman named Frances Tillman, who ran a horticultural society in Austin, and who had written to the Millhaven market about the source of the winter greens that she had heard described in a letter from a friend. Mary had written back, and Frances Tillman had written a longer letter, and 6 months later Mary had an invitation to speak at the Horticultural Society's annual meeting about winter greenhouse cultivation in the Central Texas climate. She told Joseph about it at dinner the evening the invitation arrived. He read it. He looked up at her. "You should go," he said. "It's 3 days in Austin," she said. "Daniel and Clara are my children and I am their father, and I am entirely capable of looking after them for 3 days," he said. "Your mother is in Millhaven. Raphael can manage the ranch operations. Go to Austin, Mary." She went to Austin. She stood in front of 40 women in a room in the Austin Horticultural Society and talked for an hour about winter cultivation, about soil preparation and cold frame management and greenhouse heating, and the market dynamics of off-season vegetables in a region that most growers left fallow. And when she was finished, the room was extremely alert, and Frances Tillman shook her hand with both hands and told her she was the most practical horticultural speaker they had ever had, which Mary took as the compliment it was intended to be. She came back to the ranch with 3 new seed variety catalogs, a contact at a greenhouse glass supplier in Houston who offered a better price than the San Antonio supplier, and an invitation to write a column for the Horticultural Society's quarterly newsletter. Joseph was on the porch when she rode up the road from Millhaven, and he came down the steps to take Ada's reins, and Daniel came running out behind him and flung himself at Mary's waist with the full commitment of a 4-year-old who has missed his mother, and she caught him and held him and looked at Joseph over Daniel's head. "How was it?" he asked. "I'm writing a column," she said. "They want it quarterly." He smiled at her. The full smile. Of course they do, he said. She wrote the column for 3 years, and it was reprinted in 2 other regional publications. And she received letters from women across Texas and into New Mexico Territory and Oklahoma asking about specific cultivation questions. And she answered all of them because she believed in the free exchange of practical knowledge, and also because she recognized in some of those letters the particular voice of a woman who was managing a farm or a household largely alone and needed something real and useful and not condescending. The decade turned. The ranch grew into the 1890s with the steady accumulating growth of a well-managed operation, not dramatic, not suddenly prosperous in the showy way, but genuinely solid, the way things are solid when they are built on honest work and honest accounting, and the kind of partnership that puts 2 good minds on every problem. Vernon Holt's bank ran into difficulties in 1891 when it was discovered that he had been extending credit on speculative land ventures with inadequate collateral, and the State Banking Board investigation resulted in his resignation and the reorganization of the bank under new management. Franklin Harris, who was by this time more than a lawyer and something close to a friend of the Redmond household, mentioned this to Joseph and Mary at dinner one evening with the tone of a man who has watched a just outcome arrive slowly and appreciates it more for the waiting. The southeast parcel, Mary asked. The bank sold it in the reorganization, Harris said. Bought by the Vasquez family. They've dug a well and it's producing. Mary nodded. There was a rightness to that land that had been the instrument of attempted fraud now being worked honestly by a family who needed it. The creek ran on its own side of the property line, and nobody disputed it. Rafael Diaz, who had been 19 when he arrived at the ranch and was now 28, married a woman named Lucia Garza from San Antonio in 1893, and moved with her into a house he built on a small piece of land he had bought 3 miles south of the Redmond ranch. He stayed on as a hand, though his role had evolved over the years into something closer to foreman Joseph, trusted him completely, and had given him increasing responsibility, and Raphael managed the daily cattle operations with the calm competence of a man who had grown up doing this work. Joseph and Mary went to Raphael and Lucia's wedding and ate tamales and danced on the packed dirt of the yard in the warm October evening, and Joseph was a better dancer than Mary had expected, which she told him, and he told her his mother had insisted on it, and she told him she was very grateful to his mother. The end of the century was approaching, and the world was changing around the West in ways that everyone felt differently. The railroad had reshaped the cattle business entirely, and some of the large operations to the north and west were struggling because they had built on assumptions that the railroad routes had made obsolete. Joseph had read this coming and positioned the ranch accordingly in the late 1880s, moving toward quality breeding stock rather than simple volume. And by the mid-1890s, the Redmond Ranch had a reputation for good bloodlines that brought buyers from as far as Oklahoma. Daniel, who turned 15 in 1900, was already working the ranch with the natural ease of someone who has grown up in it. He knew the land the way he knew his own hands, knew where the water ran, and where the grass was thickest in August, and where the cattle liked to shelter in a norther. He had Joseph's directness and Mary's quickness, and his grandmother Eleanor's absolute certainty about his own opinions, and he was already beginning to have thoughts about improving the irrigation system that were technically interesting and possibly correct. Clara, who was 12 in 1900, had decided she wanted to be a teacher, which she announced at Sunday dinner with the complete conviction of someone who has made a real decision and not an aspirational one. She wanted to teach in the Millhaven School, which she had attended since she was 6, and which she felt could be significantly improved in several specific ways that she was prepared to describe at length. Everyone at the table had listened carefully, and Calhoun had said, "She sounds like her mother," which Eleanor had agreed with immediately. Mary was 43 years old in 1900, and the woman she was could not be contained in any single description. She was the rancher's wife, and the household manager, and the greenhouse cultivator, and the horticultural columnist, and the mother of Daniel and Clara, and the daughter of Eleanor, who was now also the wife of Calhoun Webb, and was 66 years old and entirely herself. And she was the woman who had ridden 14 miles on a rented horse in April 1884 to sign away the only thing she had, and had found instead everything she had not known she was looking for. She was Joseph's partner in every real sense of the word, and had been for 16 years, and the partnership had not softened or dulled in the way that some things do with time, but had deepened the way good soil deepens, with everything that falls into it and decomposes and becomes something richer than what was there before. On a Sunday evening in October 1900, they sat on the porch together after dinner. Daniel had gone to the bunkhouse to talk cattle with Raphael. Clara was in the parlor reading. Eleanor and Calhoun were in Millhaven. The ranch was quiet with the particular quality of early fall quiet, the grass golden and the sky enormous, and the creek audible below the pasture. Joseph reached over and took her hand. She looked at him. He was 50 years old, and the gray at his temples had spread through his hair, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and he was the same man who had looked at a widow standing over a deed with a shaking hand and thought that a hot meal was the decent thing to offer. He was exactly who he had always been. "Are you happy?" he asked, as he asked sometimes still, not because he doubted but because he wanted to hear her say it. Mary looked out over the land that had been the ground of everything, the grief and the recovery and the work and the love and the life that had been built here from the wreckage of one story into the solidity of another. "Yes," she said, "completely." He squeezed her hand. The windmill turned. The creek ran in the dark below the pasture. The stars were coming out one by one above the Texas plain, enormous and unhurried. And the night was warm, and the land was theirs, properly, truly, in the way that land is yours when you have loved it and worked it, and made it the place where everything good in your life has taken root and grown. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He pressed his lips to her hair, and the evening settled around them like a blessing, quiet and whole and permanent, the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the accumulated proof of having met every difficulty together and come through it still holding on.